Hi all, my name is Katie Boothby-Kung, and I'm the host of Talking Purpose, a podcast where we dive deep into what it takes to build an epic, sustainable, and social impact brand. I fell in love with the idea of social entrepreneurship in university when I started my first small batch skincare social enterprise. From there, I was able to build social entrepreneurship tools and programs at Shopify, and now I'm the director of sustainability at a thriving digital agency called Creative Currency. During this journey, I've learned two things. Sustainability in business can be intimidating, and talking about it is tough. On this podcast, I'll interview experts in social entrepreneurship and brand building so that you have the tools and tricks you need to grow your purpose-driven business. Hello, and welcome to Talking Purpose, the podcast. My name is Katie Boothby-Kung, and I am your host. If you're new to this podcast, by way of quick introduction, I am a sustainability expert and consultant and have been doing this for over a decade in a number of different roles. And so I've just become so obsessed with all things sustainable business, social entrepreneurship, and I love to hear what small and medium-sized businesses are doing in this space and how they are building a for-purpose brand that is really making a difference around the world. So if you are looking to start your own social enterprise, or perhaps you already have a business and you're looking to be more sustainable, then you are in the right place. So settle in and welcome. We are so happy to have you. And for today's episode, we are meeting with Austin Whitman, and he's the CEO of Climate Neutral. It was such a pleasure to talk with him. Climate Neutral is a nonprofit organization working to eliminate carbon emissions. They do this by creating access to tools and networks that support businesses during their decarbonization journey, and they help them to measure their carbon footprint. Measuring your carbon shouldn't be hard or expensive, and Climate Neutral is lowering barriers to this impact tactic. Austin Whitman is a team facilitator, an impact fanatic, and according to his bio, a below average Zoom DJ. Austin has worked in climate and energy for 17 years as both a leader and subject matter expert. He loves the challenges and problem solving of a startup nonprofit and enjoys seeking outside adventures. In this episode, Austin discusses green certifications, the complicated world of carbon credits and offsets, and we nerd out a little on policy from our former lives. So certainly not a conversation you'll want to miss. So settle in and enjoy the show. All right. Well, hello, everyone. We are so happy to have you listening in. We are so happy to have Austin Whitman. He's joining us from Climate Neutral, an exciting company doing some really wicked stuff in the carbon and climate space. And so, Austin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Katie.
Well, let's just jump right into this. I mean, you have a long history of working in climate, really trailblazing in this space. And so tell us more about your journey. How did you kind of come to become the CEO of Climate Neutral? And what was it like working in climate when you first started compared to now, where it seems like everyone's talking about it?
That is very true. First of all, global emissions were a lot lower. And one of the things that led me to leave my last job and come on to start Climate Neutral was this horrible moment where I looked at the trajectory of global emissions basically since I started my professional career and realized that they're up like 30% over that time period, which I don't consider myself personally responsible for. But number one, it makes you feel pretty old, and number two, when you can measure your career in terms of like major percentage increase in carbon emissions, and number two, makes you feel kind of upset and disappointed that all the work that you've done on climate really hasn't amounted to much. But let's see. So I started working in software when I graduated from college, and did that for 5 years during the first .com boom. And about a couple of years into that, started feeling like there had to be something more to this whole work thing than just making software. And so started looking at graduate school programs, and ended up going back to grad school at a dual degree program for environmental management and business. And one of my sort of funnier memories from that was I remember getting into the classroom with some folks because it was this sort of environment and business program. You had people all across the spectrum. You had the diehard capitalists and you had the dyed-in-the-wool environmentalists, and everybody sort of in the same room. And I remember one class. I sort of felt like I was always in between these two. And I remember one class having some of the dyed-in-the-wool environmentalists up there talking about this project that they were working on that had to do with climate change, which even in that setting made people squirm, because climate change at the time was sort of a thing that people knew was going on, but no one really knew how to deal with it. And it had this really political connotation to it. And I remember really sort of feeling like I'd had a chance to get my head around my own personal stance. Obviously, I knew it was an issue, but not so much an issue that I had gotten my head around. So that was almost 20 years ago. A lot has changed, both personally and in the world. And the arc that led me to climate neutral took me first into the finance world, where I started working with large institutional investors on more, I guess you'd call them cutting edge investments in things like wind and solar, utility scale wind and solar developments. And then deep into the carbon markets, the first carbon markets, 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10 type timeframe. And then there was a big policy effort in the US that fell apart in 2010. And so I kind of got to sit on the sidelines for that, watching the gory process of trying to get Republicans and Democrats to agree on something massive and influential in terms of climate legislation. And then spent the better part of the next, I guess, 8 years doing a mix of policy and strategy work for everything from small NGOs on up to large government agencies and utility companies. So here we are, 3 years almost into the journey with climate neutral. And it does, as you pointed out rightly, feel like way more people are paying attention to climate change than ever before. I like to think we're at this sort of, chaotic frenzy, everybody kind of moving into the stadium before they've had a chance to find their seats, and people are sort of tripping over each other, and we'll eventually get to the right sections of the stadium and it will feel a little bit more orderly. But there are moments where I feel like, okay, there are a lot more people focused on this issue, but are we actually making the kind of progress that we need? It's not clear yet. And a great example of this that I heard yesterday on a podcast is just the extent to which venture funding has flowed into climate tech and clean tech in the last 10 years, and what little share of that has actually been directed at the highest emitting, hardest to abate sectors. So really only about a quarter of all venture funding in the last decade has gone into the more difficult to abate sectors. Venture funding has flowed toward things like software, which an indirect effect. So there's a little bit of my story and kind of where we are now.
That's awesome. And I love that. I didn't realize there was a policy angle to that. And I feel like I could go down a rabbit hole of, as a policy wonk and ex-political staffer myself, I feel like I could go down talking about that and what it's like working with governments and now what it's like, and your take on what happened at COP. But let's dive into climate neutral a little bit. Maybe we can get to some of the policy stuff in a little bit. But I mean, hearing what you're saying before, what was, really that big inspiration moment where you're like, I'm gonna do this for real. I'm gonna, make this full time. What was that moment like in your life for climate neutral?
Yeah. So the first thing that led me to, everybody reaches a point in a job where they sort of feel like it's time to maybe start looking around for something new. And I was working at a great software company that was doing a lot of great work on energy efficiency and clean tech. But a few years into it, I felt like we lost our way, and in pursuit of sort of the higher multiple and faster revenue growth, we started to lose sight of the core clean energy mission and really just serve kind of a basic use case for electric and gas utility companies that fundamentally didn't have any sort of necessarily positive outcome attached to it. So that was the moment where I thought, it's time to start looking around. And I got introduced to Peter Daring, who you've met, who was the founder of his company Peak Design. And he at the time was talking a lot about wanting to get more companies to understand and purchase carbon offsets as part of the kind of work that they're doing to minimize their impact in the world. And so I started talking to him, and then to another guy named Jonathan, who's the CEO, founder of a company called BioLite. And over the course of basically from October 2018 until March of 2019, there was a process of kicking this idea around. Peter and Jonathan had together decided that they wanted to fund a nonprofit. And I thought, hey, this would be really fun to start. And so, a brand identity, a name, a nonprofit number with the IRS, all these things kind of came together in that 6-month period. And then we officially launched in June of 2019. But what really caught me about this was two things. Number one, this was a chance to do something, where I'd worked in policy and worked in finance. This is a chance to do something very much more, I would say, grassroots or kind of movement building, in the sense of trying to engage consumers in a way that I'd never done professionally. So that felt like a third sort of big lever to pull. There's money with finance, there's policy, but then consumers felt like another untapped well for me. And then secondly, the more I talked to people like Peter, who really 3-4 years earlier had not thought at all about climate, the more I realized just how much this felt different. Like there's an opportunity to seize this interest that people have, whether it's because they read the 2018 IPCC report that gave us 12 years to hit net zero, or because friends were talking and tweeting about it, or what, I don't know. But more and more people were paying attention in a way that I think they'd never done before. So it felt like a really interesting moment to kind of leap into this consumer and brand space and try to really give people, more of a solution.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I hate calling it a trend because I don't think it is going away. I see this at Shopify a lot more, especially in the work that I'm doing. But yeah, I think that this is a really, really exciting time. I feel like we have finally turned a corner, and I think that businesses are really starting to pay attention. Whether they care about it or not, they know it's good for their bottom line at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can tell you. Just to like quick response on that, and because it's policy related, and you said you had worked in policy. I mean, I do remember kind of the feeling in 2009, 2010, where everybody thought this is great. We finally figured out a way to solve climate change, and it's going to be through these big national pieces of legislation that then flow down to all these different investments and regulations and everything else over the next 15 years. And when those efforts fell apart, it really felt like the end of a trend. It felt like the main hope was riding on these two bills that were in Congress. When that fell apart, every business that had been planning for the passage of these bills, all the modeling, all the retooling of their spreadsheets, all of the kind of the rejiggering of everything that they'd done, that just went away. And that began kind of the 7-8 year period where there really was not a lot of progress made on climate change. Obama had sort of spent all of his chips on healthcare, and there wasn't much left when it came to actually dealing with climate. So I did feel like that was a trend, and that trend ended, kind of going into that policy period and then watching it fall apart. And now, yeah, I mean, I hope you're right. I hope it isn't a trend. And I do think that one of the things that feels more permanent is just the sheer number of people who are actually working on climate change in their day to day at companies like Shopify or elsewhere. And that feels to me like it's an irreversible thing.
Yeah. And I remember too, similar in Canada, there was a time where
climate was a big talking point. And then, then the recession happened. And so that became everyone's life. And I think it was hard to justify sustainability and climate at the time because it was so expensive at the time. But I think, and what I've seen, at least in terms of consumer trends, is that the pandemic actually did the opposite, where people wanted to give back more. People wanted to spend the extra money because we were all in it together, and people were hurting and people were sick. We saw a lot of businesses shift their revenues towards charities or giving back, and talking about what it means to be socially responsible, whether that's on the human rights or the local community side or climate. But I think that it was just a different moment, because when the economy crashed back then, I think it was just a very different conversation that people were having. So yeah, that's a very good point. But I think it's here to stay. At least I hope. I like my job.
Yeah.
So I spoke with Climate Neutral probably about a year ago, and I know you were very focused on your certification process. So how does that work, and how do you think certifications benefit businesses if they're thinking about something like this?
Yeah. So our kind of initial market problem that we were trying to solve was that the world's full of labels. They're on every product, everywhere, and the minute you start looking for them, you realize they're 10 times more than you ever thought. There's something like 450 eco labels around the world, and yet when you look at the $16 trillion consumer market in the US, and even bigger than that if you factor in all of North America, there's nothing that spoke directly to the climate impacts of things that people are purchasing. And so that was the initial gap that we were trying to fill with this certification. And the certification is very simple. It standardizes the definition of carbon neutrality for any company that gets certified, and creates the same set of rules whether you're a small PR firm or a large consumer products firm. And we basically say every ton of carbon that you're responsible for generating, including carbon in your supply chain, all the way up through the point of delivering a product or service to a consumer or a business customer if you're a B2B company, all of that carbon is accounted for annually, and all of that carbon is compensated annually through the purchase of eligible verified carbon credits. And then we require companies to identify reduction actions that they're going to take in the next 12 to 24 months to begin reducing their emissions. Something that we discovered early on was that most of the frameworks have a lot of flexibility built into them. It's sort of a choose your own adventure thing. And the most important thing within a framework is a requirement for companies to say what decisions they've made in declaring carbon neutrality. Where did we draw the lines, and what are we counting, and what kinds of reduction goals do we have? And we felt like there's just too much flexibility and too much room for interpretation. So again, we try to come up with a single set of rules regardless of what type of company you are. And we now have about 340 companies that have gotten certified. It's a process that we push people through in about 3 to 4 months so that it doesn't drag on and on and on and become something that takes years. And the idea is that you do it once, and maybe it is a little bit painful, and maybe you don't learn everything that you expected to learn, or maybe you learn more than you expected to learn, but you're going to do it again in 12 months, and you'll bring all of the knowledge that you picked up the first time, bring that to bear in the second process. So you'll have better data, you'll have better understanding of where to reduce your emissions, you'll have teams internally working on this so that they can just kind of regroup and do it again. And from the consumer perspective, it takes the form of a label, which we have people put on products and into their marketing, and it provides this really just this very simple indication of a company that has gone through this process. And our goal is not to make consumers think too hard about it, but literally they can look for the label, and if they see it, that's a good thing.
Yeah, and then in terms of getting certified, can businesses work with people on your team? Is it more self-reporting? How does that all look?
Most businesses end up working with our team on certification, and it's a bit of a it becomes a bit of a sort of a, I guess, a process where we enable companies to go through the steps of getting certification, but we're also the judges to make sure that they've been through all the steps. In the ideal case, what I would say is most companies would not be working with us for certification. Most companies wouldn't be working with us for carbon measurement. They'd be using tools with the help of their own internal teams or third-party resources, but those don't exist. And something we found early on is if we wanted to get a large enough, or if we wanted to get companies to start to adopt this quickly, we couldn't rely on what I think is a really underdeveloped services market for sustainability and carbon management. And we had to provide some of our own tools. And that has allowed us to get more companies committed and certified than we would have otherwise. And I would say at this point, probably somewhere between 80 and 90% of companies that we work with are using our tools and working with our team on the work to get certified.
Okay, nice. So there is a bit of guidance if someone wasn't quite sure where to begin. They could have an expert,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
not yourself, but someone like you.
Yep. Yep.
So, and then you mentioned the marketing function. So do you think, I have some thoughts on this, but I'd love to know what you think in terms of certifications. Are they more of a marketing function for businesses, or can they actually help businesses identify and work towards climate opportunities?
You mean the certification itself or the label?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, it runs the gamut. So I would say every company is looking for some external claim that they are able to make. And even the ones that have been working longest in carbon or sustainability definitely value the ability to go out and convey this. A Clean Canteen is a good example of that. Their sustainability history runs to the beginning of the company 20 years ago. But they were one of the first companies to incorporate our label into a physical products display on shelf in Target. So they care about the marketing claim, but they also care about the hard work that goes into it. And their sustainability lead is second to none when it comes to really understanding the ins and outs of their operation and finding meaningful ways to limit their impact. So yes, there are companies in the group that are just trying to get through the certification process for the sake of doing marketing. And you know what? That's okay. I think if we hold up on trying to fix this large and complex problem until everybody has exactly the right values and everybody has exactly the right sort of, has been able to demonstrate that, whoops, sorry, this dog, nature of working from home, and everybody has been able to demonstrate that they are coming from the right place, then we'll never get there at scale. And so I think the real challenge is being able to accept that not everything is done, always perfectly and for reasons that everybody else feels comfortable with. But yes, we have a lot of companies focused on the real operational value of certification in addition to the marketing.
Yes, and I'm happy that you said that. I feel like there are some certifications out there that they think that the idea of using it as a marketing tool is horrible, and everyone who's using their certification is only there for the right reasons. Not to say that marketing isn't a right reason, but it's good for you to say that because there might be some listeners out there who aren't super sure about this whole sustainability piece and what that looks like, and just knowing that it's a good way to dip your toe in and be able to understand the ROI of these types of initiatives in terms of speaking with their consumers. I think that it's still fair because it gets people in the door, it gets people talking, it gets people thinking, and hopefully one day you can start converting hearts and minds so that it's not just a marketing function, but it's actually them saying, hey, we've used your tool and we've managed to reduce our emissions by 30% because we were able to see it. So yeah, I appreciate you saying that because it's reality. And so thank you for that. So you also have, I believe it's new this year. You can correct me if I'm wrong, the brand emissions estimator. I particularly love this tool because based on our previous conversation that we had, you have made it incredibly accessible for brands to calculate their emissions that maybe can't afford large consultants. So tell us more about the tool. Tell us how brands can use it. What does it do? What are you seeing happening with businesses when they're using the tool when it comes to their emissions or speaking with their consumers? I want to know everything, basically.
Yeah. Everything. All right. How many hours do we have?
Right.
So the brand emissions estimator actually does date to the fourth month of Climate Neutral's existence, when I was sitting around thinking, okay, we're probably going to have 36 companies that we want to certify at the end of this year. This is 2019. And I did the math and said, well, what's the cheapest we could get a consultant to go through a typical carbon measurement exercise? Probably $3,000. I mean, I was a consultant once, and you kind of don't get out of bed unless it's $5,000, and more likely it's 10 or 15. And so we thought we could get consultants down $3,000 to $3,000. But then we thought, well, okay, 3,000 times 36, who's going to pay for that? Are the companies going to pay for that? So then we have to convince companies that not only should they buy carbon credits, not only should they pay us a little bit for the brand, but they're also going to have to pay an external consultant $3,000. And so I did the math on that and then looked around and thought, well, there's got to be some other technology-based way to do this more easily and cheaply. And strangely, there was nothing that was easy and cheap enough to license and available. There were a couple software tools online, but not maintained, not comprehensive. So we ended up hiring a software developer out of the Ukraine and a life cycle assessment expert who's been involved, as far as I can tell, in every single piece of research that has ever existed in LCA. And we worked with them for 8 months on developing this incredibly primitive piece of software, and used it to certify not 36, but 150 companies in the first year. And thank God we did, because it would have been just an absolute disaster if we'd gone the first route, which is to make everybody hire consultants. So it's evolved from there into something that actually has, a pretty substantial user base when you combine across the companies who are getting certified, as well as a small but growing user base of companies that aren't getting certified. One of the things that we committed to early on was just to deliberately cut corners in this process. And I think what we learned from talking to a bunch of the LCA consultants was that the academic foundation for carbon measurement has been around for decades. I mean, literally back to the 1930s, when people were trying to figure out how you tally up, not necessarily carbon, but the environmental impacts of a supply chain. And when you look at that, and you look at the fact that consultants have been doing what they do in this space for, not as long, but at least for several decades, there's really been little advance in software making this more accessible. It feels like, hey, there's a really big opportunity here to make it easier for people. And that a lot of what happens in those consulting processes is, in my view, meant to make you feel like you should be paying $30,000 or $40,000 for the engagement. And which isn't to say there aren't wonderful people in the space doing great work, but I think that the industry has really fallen far behind on deploying technology to make the information that comes out of one of these exercises more accessible. And when you look at the calculations and the data that goes into a carbon measurement exercise, there's really sort of two ways to go about it. One is just to pull what are called emission factors off the shelf. Emission factor is just a coefficient for a certain material process or economic activity, and how much carbon was tied to that process or activity. And you can pull emission factors off the shelf for just about anything in the world. It's not going to be specific to your exact process and product, but it's what consultants use in 98% of the cases. The other way to do it is to develop primary data, to actually look at your supply chain and to go and do a deep dive into, all the processes and the actual specific farm or factory or otherwise facility. And that, of course, costs a lot of money, and it's what the largest companies in the world do, but mostly smaller companies don't. So if most companies are relying on this first approach, which is to pull emission factors off of the shelf, let's figure out how much those emission factors actually cost. And is there really any sort of value that you should be paying for those emission factors? Because the basic calculation is very simple. And what you find is that everybody uses the same emission factors, and most of them come from either free or very, very cheap sources. So why is it that consultants make this information very inaccessible? And increasingly, the new software platforms that are out there make this information very inaccessible because they charge you lots and lots of money for the software. So we felt like, if the goal here, keep your eye on the ball, right? The goal here is to just get companies to understand their carbon emissions. Can we do this with technology relatively cheaply and in a credible way that matches what consultants would consider to be credible and what matches with international standards, but doesn't require companies to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars? And whether we can have kind of a moral argument about this, whether companies should or shouldn't be paying a lot of money for this information. Yes, every company should be paying more to deal with their carbon emissions, but if you want to accelerate change, you have to sort of bite your tongue sometimes. And in this case, yes, we do try to give services to companies as cheaply as we possibly can, because we just want them to get off their butts and actually do something about the problem.
Yeah, and that's what I love. And I mean, it's fair to say that, if you want exact data where someone, goes through years and years of your emissions data for your entire supply chain, I mean, that probably should cost a bit of money because of the amount of work that is needed to do something like that. But if small companies are just looking to get started, I think that this is such a wonderful tool that you've built. So you do talk about, I have a question, and I feel like some of the listeners that are prone to ask the why and the how questions, is you work in estimates. So do you fear that that could be seen as greenwashing because it's more of an estimate? Or, how are you seeing consumers react to that data? Or is it, companies are very transparent in the fact that it is an estimate, and this is, how they're using that data to be better in this climate space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we do as you rightly point out, we call it an estimate, the brand emissions estimator. And that's because there is no such thing as an actual precise calculation, period. Even if you spend 10 years doing detailed custom LCAs, there's still no way to do that in an exact fashion. And just as an example of that, when you use a megawatt hour of electricity from your electric grid, there's pretty much no technology that can tell you exactly how many emissions you generated. And most cases, people are using average emission factors over the course from the course of a year. In some cases, it's maybe monthly, but very rarely. And in most electric grids around the world, particularly places like China, we only have data at the national level, or maybe 2 or 3 subnational levels. But the point is that when you're trying to do these calculations, you end up having to estimate in any scenario. And so that is what it is. And then the question is, how do you make it so that an estimate is more credible? Well, number one, if you're going to use, the more estimation and kind of corner cutting that you do, the more you need to round up and add assurance factors so that the end result you are confident is going to be, in 95% of cases, higher than what the theoretical actual footprint is. Another way to avoid this being greenwashing is just to make sure that you're estimating everything. In other words, we're not trying to estimate just the emissions tied to the people who ride their bikes to your office. We're trying to do emissions from actually, I'll continue that thought in a sec. But one of the funnier things we've seen recently is a very precise work from home emissions calculator, which we all looked at. And we're like, why? Why try to make your work from home emissions calculator that precise? Because for any company out there, the emissions tied to people sitting in their living rooms on a laptop don't make a bit of difference in the grand scheme. It's people who get on airplanes, and then for companies that make products, it's companies that manufacture things and ship them around the world. So anyway, so rather than focusing on those smaller things, make sure that you're including the things that are likely to be bigger. And for us, that includes carbon from cradle to customer. And then thirdly, be transparent about what you're doing about those emissions. So I think a lot of people have wrongly focused on measurement as the end point, and measurement is really just the beginning point. And you can do a lot after measurement, even with an estimate. So get to a point where you feel like you've got a decent estimate, and then figure out what you're doing from there, and actually disclose what steps you're taking after that. And we decided to take this approach of requiring companies to identify reduction actions over the next 12 to 24 months, because even the companies that had set 10-year, 20-year targets for reductions could not tell you what they were planning to do in the next 12 months to reduce their emissions. It was sort of like, well, we've set this long-term goal, and we're in the process of forming working groups, and over the next 3 years we'll figure, no. 3 years, you're 3 years into your 10-year target. So how are you actually going to make progress? So we said 12 to 24 months is the first thing that companies should come up with. Secondly, they should have medium-term reduction goals, 5 to 10-year reduction goals. And then if you want to set a net zero by 2040 or 2050 goal, that's great. But I guarantee that's not going to, become the basis for any sort of compensation-based incentives or anything that teams are actually motivated by.
That's too bad that you end on that note. But I appreciate you.
I haven't seen it yet, and I don't know how you. I guess maybe a company could structure an incentive or a bonus around progress toward a 2040 or 2050 net zero target. But CEOs, boards, they aren't motivated by what's going to happen in 30 years.
Yeah, because some of them aren't going to be with that company anymore. But challenge is out there. I'm putting it out there that if you can figure out a way to compensate your employees for reducing emissions over time, I think that would be, it would just be an interesting case study, frankly.
Well, I think year by year, absolutely. And I think that, maybe your yearly targets or KPIs, OKRs, whatever 3-letter acronym you want to use to track, they should be based around annual progress, as opposed to, I think we're moving in the right direction for 10 or 20 years from now.
Right. But I do appreciate you talking about kind of, thank you for saying that most things are an estimate, that needed to be said. But also, just being transparent, just like constantly, like it's not a bad thing to have estimates, and it's just talk about it. And that goes for everything. And, the best companies in this space, in the sustainability space, are saying what they're doing really well. And they're also saying what they need to work on. They're not trying to sweep it under the rug and pretend it doesn't exist, because consumers aren't idiots, Mm-hmm. And so, yep. I think that those are some really great steps for some of our listeners to think about. What do you think the impact of these calculations will have on commerce overall? Like, what is your hope that businesses being armed with this information, what's the great world impact?
Yeah, number one, my hope is that just by continuing to chip away at measurement with hundreds and hundreds of companies, is that we will show people something that we have already told them, which is that if you actually estimate your carbon emissions and you multiply that carbon emissions by some reasonable price per ton, $10, $20, $30 a ton, it's still not that much money. And the big challenge that we have with climate is just, the reason everybody's always wringing their hands about the right way to solve it is we're only working with about a quarter to a third of the amount of money that we actually need to solve the problem. So of course, everybody's fighting over resources and arguing that their solution is better than the other solution. The problem goes away if you create enough resources, enough funding for solutions, because then there's funding for everything. So the insight that we want to get to people is, this is a big problem, but if you look at your own emissions and figure out at a $10, $20, $30 per ton carbon price what your own carbon footprint could be valued at, it's actually not anywhere near as much as you might fear. Maybe you don't even have a sense for what it would be, but number one, it's a lot cheaper than you might think. And number two, I think we hope to give companies a basis for just forming internal working groups on this problem that will become a permanent part of the operating structure. We're starting to see sustainability people really actually have authority and have responsibility within companies. And so that you asked, how will this change commerce? I think actually giving sustainability people responsibility for key parts of companies like operations, product design, as opposed to just writing press releases and sustainability reports, that will be a big step forward. Making more people more literate in terms of climate change. I think, getting people away from thinking that understanding the biomass share of their electricity usage is somehow going to be the answer to solving their footprint challenges, when in fact that's like 0.2% of their overall emissions, and just making them more literate in the other sources. The fact that where they manufacture makes a huge difference. What work they're doing with their suppliers makes a huge difference. And all that is possible with really just relatively coarse estimates of what your emissions are.
That's awesome. And I mean, it could probably be a whole other podcast on, the role of a director of sustainability within a company. Because they have a huge responsibility, and I think companies just need to kind of give them the keys. That's a great point. So, I mean, I think you kind of alluded to this question, but the BHAG, if you will, the big, hairy, audacious goals for climate neutral and the fight against climate change. Like, what would be the 5 to maybe 50 years? I know that's a pretty big span, but we're talking about that climate, that net zero piece. How do you see climate neutral playing a big part in this, and what are some of your dreams for the company?
One thing which I've been thinking about a lot is where we fit in alongside this kind of increasingly commonly accepted framework of net zero by 2050, science-based targets, reductions to get there. I think that those are great. I think we need to add to that carbon neutrality as a transition strategy, meaning carbon neutrality is something that every company should seek to achieve immediately. And that is part of transition strategy to make your reductions happen and to get to net zero by 2050. And the kind of more commonly thought of transition strategy is something like accept that natural gas is an important part of the electric sector to get us off of coal and to get us toward renewables, right? People just generally kind of have gotten, not everybody, but a lot of people have gotten to recognize that something like natural gas as a fuel can be a bridge fuel to a cleaner future. You have to do these things in the interim that aren't perfect, but they're going to be the enabler of getting you where you need to go. And I think of carbon neutrality really as the same thing. And recently, I think people have, if anything, been backing off of the idea that carbon neutrality is a good thing. And my big fear there is that what's left is this kind of vague hope and promise of achieving reductions without any specificity, over the next 20, 30 years. So number one, I think for us, we want to kind of really get people thinking about the idea of carbon neutrality as a bridge strategy, as a transition strategy. Number two, we want to get thousands of consumer brands on board with this and certified and having gone through the process and getting the label out there in front of consumers so that more and more people start to recognize that it's not just the car that you drive and the house that you live in that's contributing to climate change, but also the effect of the consumer dollars that you're spending every day. And by putting the label there on products, we'll start to draw that connection more clearly. And then what else? I mean, maybe I'll leave it at that. Two big goals. I mean, obviously we have big goals around more technology and making it more accessible to more companies. Yeah.
It's a good place. It's a good place to end. Like those are some pretty substantial goals. And I think, yeah, I like that you said that, because the naysayers of this sustainability world, it's an all or nothing for a lot of people, especially the critics, when, just starting somewhere is the biggest thing that you can do in this space. So I think that's a wonderful goal to have. So we'll leave it at that. But where can everyone find you if they're looking to learn more, maybe connect with you? Where can they find all that?
Well, we're at climateneutral.org is our website. We have social media, as everyone does. Our Instagram is Be Climate Neutral, and our Twitter is Climate Neutral. And LinkedIn, we're also pretty active on. We have not yet gotten ourselves onto TikTok. I've been told that that's an important thing for us to do on this year. We'll see. Don't look for us on TikTok yet, but maybe in the near future. But LinkedIn is a great place to connect with me and with other folks in the company.
Awesome. Well, Austin, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. This has been very fruitful, and so I'm sure our listeners will really love it.
Thank you, Katie. Great conversation. And thanks for what you're doing at Shopify. And keep it up.
Awesome.
Thank you all for listening. If you're interested in learning more about social entrepreneurship and building a sustainable brand, I invite you to head over to sustainabilityco.me for more episodes and valuable resources to help you launch and amplify your purpose-driven brand. Resources range from supply chain help to impact storytelling and marketing tools. If you'd like to chat one-on-one, drop me a line. I always love hearing from listeners and other sustainable businesses. In the words of the past Layla Jana, make it your business to figure out what good needs to be done in the world and then do it. Talk soon.